Buffett's webinar series of this quarter. Our theme is SDG 13, climate action. And today we have a wonderful panel of speakers that will talk about the role of activism, social movements, and advocacy in driving climate action. And we title it somehow provocatively, whether that can actually save the world or not. We have three wonderful panelists. We have Brayden King, who's a professor at Kellogg, and my colleague. Where he's also the McGaw Chair of Environmental Management. We have Kady McFadden, who is at the Sierra Club, is the Illinois head of the Sierra Club. And then we will have Phil, who will join us as soon as he can. So I'll introduce him when he actually joins and do a quick introduction. The order of the initial statements is that Brayden will start us off, then Kady, and then Phil. So I turn it over to Brayden.
Great. So let me just put my slides up. So first, let me thank Klaus and the Buffett Institute for inviting us to do this session. I love to talk about activism, and it's even more fun when I get to do so with activists, and so I'm excited to be on this panel with Kady and Phil when he gets here. My own research has focused a lot on how social movements can lead change. Like, what do they do? What are the mechanisms that make activists have an impact on the world? And it's certainly the case, we know from lots of historical archival research, that social movements have been integral to a lot of societal transformations in our world. It's hard to imagine how we would be living in a world where you're seeing progress on racial justice or advancing the cause of LGBTQ movement without people doing stuff, without people engaging in protests, other forms of collective action to advance their cause. And the environmental movement, certainly counts among the most successful social movements in pushing for change. I think it's now become an iconic movement of our time. It rose, of course, in the 1960s with sort of an emphasis on conservationism, and how it now is, of course, leading the charge to combat its biggest challenge, the world's biggest challenge, I believe, which is climate change. And the question we're asking today is, how do activists convince the world's powers to change the ways of running the economy, to change the ways of regulating emissions and pollutants in order to prevent climate change from happening? I want to present just basically a few facts that we know from research, and then talk a bit about what I see as the challenges for the environmental movement going forward. So the first fact, I think, is one that's fairly uncontroversial, which is that the environmental movement is growing in scale. Just the sheer number of organizations, but also the number of people who are participating in some way or another in the environmental movement has never been bigger. Before COVID sort of shut down a lot of collective action, the environmental movement was really gaining a lot of steam. 2019 was a monumental year for environmental protests. In the week of the climate strike, more than 7.6 million people around the globe participated in protests and marches. And this was not just in the United States or in Europe, it was around the world, in every continent. In New Zealand alone, 3.5% of their population participated in demonstrations that week. And these protests, of course, are just one of many. I think you could look over the years and see that the size of the protests have been increasing gradually, including many of the climate marches that were around events such as the Paris Treaty that was done a few years ago. And I think what's impressive about them is just how grassroots oriented they are, where they're bringing together young people, older people, families to make their voices heard. And so the size of the movement, I think, is one important fact to make us feel hopeful, certainly about the role of activism. The second fact has to do, I think, with the role of the environmental movement in the broader sphere of social movement, progressive activism for sure. And that is that the fact is that it's becoming more and more central. If you go back to the 1960s, the movement was fairly peripheral. The figure that you're looking at is from a study that I did with Busak Jung, a former colleague of mine, a former student of mine who's now at ITC Paris, and Sarah Soule at Stanford. And what we found is that over time, the movement has become more and more central in the social network of activists who participate in protests. And by central, I mean that it's sort of, you think of it as like an organizing hub, where when you're peripheral, you're kind of on your own and isolated from other activist groups. As the movement becomes more central, you find activists from other communities, other causes joining up with environmentalism as a way to push for change. Some examples of that I think are pretty evident. You see now that the cause of racial justice is becoming integrated with an environmental movement as environmental justice, recognizing that oftentimes those two things, racism and the destruction of the environment, go together. That is, that people who are discriminated against are oftentimes the ones who are bearing the larger brunt, the larger costs of environmental damage. And of course, the labor and human rights movement has focused more of their effort on how to improve environmental conditions, especially because the economies of the poorest countries are being the greatest, most affected by climate change. So as a result of that, the movement is more diverse than ever. It is globally and within our own country quite diverse. The third fact I want to point to is has to do with the sorts of tactics that social movements use, that the environmental movement uses, and how that kind of fits within the overall strategy of the movement. So the movement is becoming more tactically diverse. This is this figure that you're looking at here is from a study that I did with Laura Nelson, who's now at Northeastern, moving to University of British Columbia in the fall. And in this study, we looked at all of the media coverage related to the environmental movement, that is movement organizations, since from 1998 to 2014. And we did some kind of fancy computational text analysis, which I won't go into. But the result of that was that we were able to kind of categorize different kinds of tactics that movement organizations use and how prevalent they are in media coverage. You can tell from this graph that still the most common tactic that gets publicity, at least, would be what we call conflictual tactics that are focused on institutional change. So these would be the protests, the marches, the demonstrations that are targeting governments or companies. Boycotts, for example, would fit in this category. But over time, this is becoming less and less prevalent, less and less common, and other kinds of tactics are becoming more prevalent. So for example, mobilizing communities to find local solutions for environmental problems that they're facing is becoming almost just as common now as conflictual oriented tactics. And at the very bottom, also becoming more common are what we call cooperative or collaborative tactics. So this would be where activists sit down and negotiate outcomes with corporations or governments to find kind of cooperative solutions to enhance environmental protection. So it's interesting to see that the environmental movement isn't a one-trick pony. It's very much a diverse movement that also has a diverse set of tactics, and it's becoming increasingly diverse. So those are, I think, hopeful facts. Now I'm going to focus on the negative, which is that the problems are getting worse. So we're living in a world in which climate change is very much a threat. We know that climate change is related to emissions that are created by humans and organizations that are run by humans. And this graph, which comes from one website, ourworldindata.org, demonstrates that over time, we have a rapid increase of the amount of emissions, and that's linked to the amount of sort of temperature rises that we see in our environment. So despite the success of environmental activists in grabbing public attention through their tactics, legitimating their cause, we are far from instituting solutions that are making meaningful dent into this particular problem. And I think that is probably the major challenge for environmental activists going forward, is how to put a halt to this damage. So I want to talk about 4 other particular challenges that are all kind of related to that big one. The first is, environmental problems are systemic. So we know that Climate change is produced not just by one country, it's not just produced by one organization, it's very much a collective problem that results from an economy that thrives based on market growth. And that is in turn linked to just a growth in the amount of pollutants that we put into our environment. And to get, really make a change to that, you have to change the system. But of course, elites and other power holders and governments don't have incentives to do that. It would require some cooperation or collective action among the elites in order to really make a difference in solving that systemic problem. How do activists who are themselves, still a minority of the population, get these elite groups of people and organizations to cooperate enough to actually make a difference in that systemic problem? I'm not sure we yet have the answer to that. Related to that is a second point, which is that we have to be able to hold the polluters accountable for what they do. I think the environmental movement has been most successful at getting organizations and governments to make commitments to stemming the tide of climate change. But commitments don't necessarily immediately, at least, translate into actual behavioral practice changes in the way that we run our economy. And part of that has to do with, who's the organization, who are the group of people who are monitoring and enforcing these commitments. It turns out that I tell people that much of our data on emissions comes from the organizations themselves. They self-report, how much they're polluting the environment. People are surprised by this, but that reflects the larger problem, which is that we don't have organizations that go in there and monitor every single organization's output. So who monitors and then who enforces that? When we live in a society where the state, the government, is weakened in their ability to do that, that's a big problem. I think at the movement level, there are two issues I want to talk about. One is coordination at the movement level. So as the movement gets bigger, and you see more organizations, more environmental organizations arising, and many of them are kind of differentiated in their particular mission, their strategy that they take. How does that, lead to a coherent global strategy? Given that climate change is a systemic problem, it'd be great if the environmental movement did kind of cohere around a common strategy. I don't know if that has yet happened. I'll actually kind of pass that over to Kady and Phil to talk more about that. And then the fourth challenge I see is fragmentation within the movement. We love the fact, I think, that the movement has become diverse, and of course the environmental movement wants to be as inclusive as possible so that all voices are heard as we seek to solve these problems. At the same time, we know that as the movement becomes more diverse, there's a potential for conflict within the movement, in part just created by the fact that you have local organizations that are struggling against different problems. One example that came to mind, there was a great article in the New Yorker this week that talked about local activists in Gambia who are struggling for environmental justice and protection from fisheries that are kind of overfishing, and that's destroying their local economy. That's an important problem for them, but it's not always clear that those local problems are compatible with the broader goals of the bigger kind of global movement. And so how do we be inclusive and have a big tent without leading to complete fragmentation? So I'll stop there. I think these are the challenges I wanted to lay out, and I'll pass the baton now to Kady and let her talk about her experience as an activist at the Sierra Club.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's fun to kind of be on one end of this work and see the trends, and I'm happy to kind of provide and color in from my perspective some reactions and some thoughts on directionality I see of the movement. But thanks for having me. My name is Kady McFadden. I'm the Deputy Director at the Illinois chapter of the Sierra Club. Grateful to be part of this panel, even though I have hair, so I stand out. But I just have a couple visuals that I'm gonna share. So I'm gonna share my screen here 1 second. And just another note about me, I have worked in the climate action advocacy space for the past decade. Before that, I was a student activist around climate issues. So I have kind of seen the evolution just in the past decade of this movement, but kind of been on the front lines of it. And a lot of what I do in my role is help figure out where we should be pushing forward, what our strategy looks like. But also a big part of what I do is on the political side, and the Sierra Club is unique in that we get involved in elections. We try to endorse and elect candidates who are strong in the environment, and recognizing the ever increasing value of making sure that people who are elected to write and vote on environmental laws are as committed to these issues as we are. So if you don't know the Sierra Club, we're the oldest and largest environmental organization in the country. And the reason why I'm going to speak a little bit to the Sierra Club is I think it is a good sort of case study in the evolution of environmental activism. You can really see it in how the Sierra Club looked in the past and was founded, and sort of what it looks like today. We have over 3 million members across the country. We were founded by John Muir, who's on your screen. And if you think about when we were founded, we were truly a club. You had to be referred by at least 3 other people to get in. And so, we were founded based on conservation. John Muir was wanting to conserve the lands of this country, and in a lot of ways, some pretty racist roots in wanting to protect land, take from some to protect so that they could be enjoyed largely by white folks who were of more privilege. And so recognizing that that's sort of how we started and was exclusionary in the way we set up the organization, that you had to be referred and kind of know somebody, I think looks a lot different than if you were to conjure up in your mind an image of an environmental activist today in the year 2021. I think that looks a lot more like this. This is from the People's Climate March a number of years ago, but our movement is so much now recognizing the folks on the front line of crisis, as you can see on this banner, really need to be also on the front lines of the solutions. And so, our movement looks a lot younger and more diverse than it did, frankly, on the first Earth Day in 1970. So this is an image I see a lot in my work, but it's sort of what Brayden said, but kind of how I talk about it, which is that we recognize very explicitly when we're planning campaigns, that these problems are all connected. I got involved when I was a student, as I mentioned, on issues of climate activism. And at that point, I saw very clearly that the only reason why we weren't following what the majority of the world's scientists were telling us we needed to do to have a planet we could live on in the future, which seems like a non-controversial thing, we were not taking action on that because of the things you see on your screen, because of racism, because of economic inequality, because of broken democracy, because there are a few at the top who wanted to continue to profit off the current system, and they had the power to keep it that way. And so in kind of recognizing that that's where we stand, the answer is to recognize that we can't just say, well, this whole system's wrong, but only because we're not taking climate action. The whole system is having a lot of unintended intended consequences, but consequences that I would argue are not to the benefit of society, including racism, including inaction on climate. And if we can't sort of as climate activists only say, well, this is the part that's wrong. We have to acknowledge sort of all of those problems and also recognize that the solutions are connected. So as I mentioned, these 2 slides from the Movement Strategy Center are ones that I have seen a number of times. We train on, we talk about these things very explicitly in the work that we do. The Sierra Club specifically, also when it comes to kind of strategies that we're employing organizationally, the chart that you saw, the Sierra Club employs really brilliant lawyers, brilliant communication strategists. At the end of the day, we are an organizing shop. We have 3 million members across the country. That's our strength. How do we mobilize people? How do we do grassroots organizing so that we can push policy, so that we can elect climate champions, so that we can get our cities to take action on climate? So sort of from the local, your town, all the way to the federal level. And that's really what we see as what can really make change in the system that we're in. And one thing I wanted to show, this is kind of, it's an image and a thing that we use a lot, but I thought it might be interesting to folks because a lot of, as I mentioned, you know, we have just the environmental movement. There are enough issues to work on just there, right? We can work on water pollution, air pollution, you know, migratory species. There's so many things. And then you add in, oh yeah, also we need to recognize that we got to work on racism and income inequality and to break, you know, fixing our democracy. And so sort of a lot of times people ask me, you know, how do you figure out where to aim? You know, how do you figure out what you're working on and what defines success and how you're pushing, you know, all of your resources? And, you know, that's a lot of what my job is, but I wanted to put up this visual because this is what we use a lot of times to determine that. So you may have heard the term theory of change. I always say a theory of change is how are we going to win? What do we want? Who has the power to give it to us? How do we get them to do it? And we have to be able to answer those questions. And I think this is an example of how we're getting even more sophisticated. You know, instead of just saying this thing is bad, let's take to the streets and just assume that enough people in the streets are going to fix it. We're getting a lot more specific and strategic and tactical in our work. And so I like this house example because the roof is the tactics. So this is, as Brayden mentioned, it's the things you see. It's the rallies, it's the press conferences, it's the op-eds in your local newspaper. It's, but in the house analogy, the roof is the last thing that you build. So when we're building a campaign, we start with that foundation, we build the house, and then we get to the roof, the tactics. So when you're seeing that march or that, you know, article in the paper, you're seeing the product of a whole house that we've built, deciding on what tactic we want to take forward. And in particular, that I think that is a new addition to this house model is what we call the foundation, recognizing that you have to start with the impacted communities, the folks who are on the front line of the struggle, that of the environmental struggle. You have to start with those internal and external partners. We're very clear that we don't oftentimes, if ever, have the power on our own to win the things we want. We need to bring together coalitions. We need to recognize who else needs to be in the room. And it's with those partners, with those communities, that we actually develop the goals. So you'll recognize the goal comes after engaging those folks. And then that's where you build the other pieces of the campaign. The target, who is it that can give you what you want? Secondary targets, target audience, it's how you can get at the target, the messaging, kind of what are we saying we're for, and then we build the tactics. So just a point about our strategy here. I also want to note one thing that has that I think is a challenge point that I agree with a lot is just the last 4 years having living in a country that was led by a climate denier did mean that we as a movement kind of had a common enemy. This was a president who also was alienating other constituencies, immigrant groups, labor, as well as environment. And so as we were all sort of trying to hang on and protect the progress that we had made to date, that I think brought organizations and coalitions together around that. Now that we have a president in President Brayden who has said he is, for bold action on climate, he is for, labor, working families and a living wage. He is, for immigrant justice. It's a little bit, there's going to be a potential trap to fall in, to believe in sort of zero-sum politics, and that we can't all push forward, and that we're going to have to kind of fight amongst ourselves. And so I see that personally, where from my vantage point, as a pretty big threat right now. And then very briefly, we have had so many local wins, and so I put up this graph about coal plants retired to date. This is just a statistic from the United States. Even given the last 4 years, we have made a lot of progress, and that has been at the local level, as noted. But I agree with the recognition that these are all cities and states that have actually committed to 100% clean energy. And the question as to how do we hold that accountable and how do we actually get from commitment to an action is largely something we're having to figure out as we go along. You know, it's wonderful how many states, how many cities have said they're making this commitment, but what does activism look like when, frankly, the politicians are on your side when they say you're for the thing, whether it's the president or the governor or the mayor, but actually getting them, you know, can we pivot our systems that we built for activism to actually work for inside the system in enacting what we want. So, you know, I'll just end with this one thing that I always think of when I see, you know, the scary climate graphs and where we're at, and just recognizing that we have so much to do to take action on climate. You know, the politics part is not going to be easy. It never has been. I don't think it ever will be. But the scientific part, I mean, it is just scientifically necessary that we get there. And so recognizing how fragile and important the next few years are, I'm looking forward to what's next.
Thank you both for the wonderful presentations and comments. It seems that Phil Radford will not be able to make it today, but we will continue with just the two of you. We're already getting a lot of questions in, and I want to start out with maybe a very general one, and that is, if you look at the changing landscape of climate change, activism, but also policy, where do you see the sort of biggest challenges for activist organizations in pushing this agenda forward so that we actually see substantial changes? I'm thinking of, you know, Brayden's chart, which essentially said activism's gone up, but, you know, climate mitigation hasn't actually, you know, sort of happened at the same time. So where do you see the biggest challenges looking into the future for activist organizations in driving climate action?
Kady, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'll reiterate a couple notes. So I think that first off, I definitely agree with the fact that we have a big challenge in front of us. We are not where we need to be from a carbon emission standpoint. But I also think we have made more progress than perhaps was shown on that graph. So it's something to think about. But where I think urgency is number one. Like here's the shifts that we have made. We are in a place now where in most places in the United States of America, wind energy is cheaper than fossil fuels. We are in a place, you know, we've sort of, we've made a shift in the electric sector. Like I mentioned, the coal plant retirements, a lot of those fights have been community by community saying, we don't want this in our backyard anymore. And so recognizing what does now this transition look like? Because as you all well know, and folks watching well know, the day that wind becomes cheaper than coal, it's not like you flip a switch and all the coal plants disappear and all the wind farms. You know, economics by themselves do not fix this problem. You have to have the activism, you have to have the laws in place to actually make that shift, even when the economics are in your favor. And so I think that transition and ensuring that it's as quick as it needs to be is really critical, because we do not have time. And then second, I think, you know, I mentioned this, but in the accountability and in the recognizing that there's not a zero sum, you know, we frankly, you know, a really specific example is here in Illinois, we are getting ready to pass what is the boldest and most equity-centered piece of climate legislation that any state has ever even considered. Here in Illinois, we're getting ready. And we frankly lost a year of progress and work on that, you know, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so recognizing how are we packaging and talking about solutions to climate as recovery mechanisms. How are these, you know, how are we moving forward in that frame as, you know, recognizing that climate action is also a way to address racial injustice, which is also of increasing importance this year, given the year that we had in 2020. And so, the more that these can be seen and advocated on together, we can take action. But those are other things that deserve, COVID-19 recovery and racial injustice are things that deserve a lot of attention right now. And so recognizing that we're not fighting against that, we're not saying us first, we're saying us together. And that is really going to be key going forward.
Yeah, so I feel like my job to be the more of the pessimist, and that's why I put up that chart. Not because I don't think we can't make progress, but more just because I think that we have to kind of deal with the reality, which is that this is a global problem, and so global solutions will be probably the only way that we'll really be able to get where we need to be in order to reverse some of the damages being caused by climate change. And if you remember that graph, well, I'll just summarize. One of the main points in that graph is that the US has more or less stabilized as a contributor to emissions. We're not getting worse, but we're not getting that much better over recent years. The EU is they've actually decreased their share of emissions. The two parts of the globe where you see the major part where you see the biggest increases are in Asia, particularly from China. And that's not to point the finger at China. This is just to say that, if you resolve the problem in one country, you potentially, you still have ongoing pollutants being emitted in other countries. And so we really have to figure out how to combat this at the global level, when there is no governance mechanism. There's no, for example, no world government that would allow us to pass a kind of policy that we would need to control those countries. On sort of the side of hope, I think that we do have more support in the business community now for combating climate change than we probably have ever had. And I'm hopeful that, where governments lack the ability to do something that has teeth, the business community may recognize that it's in their long-term interest to do something. And so I guess my hope is that the activists and the business community will get on the same page as the activists. So the activists need to be targeting the business community as much as they are governments, recognizing that if you can get the business community to put pressure on governments, it's probably going to have a bigger impact. You still have the enforcement problem, the collective action problem that results from businesses all wanting to do what's individually good for them. But they have to be a part of the solution if we're going to make something that works.
Kady, do you see? This is an interesting question around, sort of what should be the primary targets or partners for organizations like the Sierra Club? Do you see businesses as partners or as targets that you have to hold accountable?
I think it's a little bit of both. It depends on the business. But I have a couple thoughts. One is I do credit the movement of the business community to be more environmentally, or caring more about their environmental image or their environmental footprint. I give activists a lot of credit as to being the source of that. Even the times when perhaps the business community wasn't the primary target, I do think we live fundamentally, in a different world. And it's because of the activists who have made this such a kitchen table issue. Excuse me. And so there's absolutely a role for businesses to play and to lead. I personally believe that given the gravity of the situation when it comes to climate action, that voluntary commitments from the business community will always fundamentally fall short, and we have to have government frameworks in place to get the emissions reductions that we need, both in the US and globally. But to the extent that there are partners corporations who are willing to be partners and are making these pledges, of which there are many, and those are driving the sector. I don't mean to discount that, but I think it's just fundamentally always going to fall short. So it's never quite enough.
This might be a good transition, but we have a good number of questions that sort of center around the questions of climate justice, social justice, the extent to which the environmental movement is sort of inclusive or has become more elitist and likes to work with the powerful and wealthy. Where do you see what's your assessment, first of all? Is this something that has become a blind spot for environmentalism? And is there a institutional barrier for that? Is there a way to sort of remedy that and make climate justice more central to environmentalism?
Sure. My thoughts on that are, I always like to say, working for the Sierra Club, it feels like I have one foot inside the door and one foot outside the door. And sort of what I mean by that is, you know, we have 3 million members, as I mentioned. We have numerous partners on the ground. We have, you know, people in every city, you know, in America, essentially, who are really holding us true to being a grassroots organization. But on the other side of the coin, we do, you know, endorse candidates, which means we put our seal of approval on a certain candidate, and you know, we lobby legislators, which means fundamentally, you know, working through the legislative process is fundamentally means compromise. And you know, that's how we write laws, and that's how, you know, a lot of times lobbying works. And you know, a lot of times endorsing candidates, they may not be perfect on everything or exactly where we want them to be. And so if we decide to engage in those sorts of tactics, they're, you know, always going to be, you know, not uncredible claims that, you know, we are not, you know, as pure or, you know, true enough to those folks on the ground if we engage in things that some folks see as, you know, ultimately meaning compromise. And so, you know, I've had to learn to be comfortable with that, but also be cognizant of that constantly, because it's not enough to just say, well, this is inherently compromise. You know, you have to stay true to where our values are, but also where the science is and where the numbers are and where we need to be when we're in those spaces, but also, you know, responsive to the folks on the ground. I'll also say, you know, the Sierra Club is not the environmental movement. We are one organization. And so recognizing that, you know, there are a lot of environmental organizations, there are a lot of community-based environmental organizations, and that's a good thing. You know, if we were all the same, then we wouldn't be a vibrant movement. So, you know, recognizing too that like we all have a different role to play.
Yeah, this is sort of the flip side of the earlier point I made, which is that, you know, it absolutely is true that solutions to you know, climate change issues, not just climate change, all environmental problems, you know, require in some way getting the business community on board and cooperate, or, you know, or you're not going to make a dent into the problems. But we have to remember that businesses, corporations, are not democratic institutions. You know, they're designed by nature to pursue very specific causes. That cause mean to make money for them and their shareholders, and, you know, for many of these organizations, it's to grow, to create grow shareholder value, and that purpose is oftentimes, you know, opposed to, you know, our desire to be democratically open, and that limits the voices who have a say, and especially voices that have been historically ignored, which are also the voices the people who tend to be most damaged by the issues we're dealing with regarding climate change and other environmental pollutions. And so I agree with Kady that, you know, the grassroots has to be a part of this in order to make a vibrant movement, but also to ensure that whatever solutions we arrive at are solutions that don't just benefit, you know, the elites, but that they include, you know, they're also looking out for local communities of all types. And that's actually one reason why, you know, I asked Kady if she was interested in talking on this panel, because I know that the Sierra Club is a movement organization that's committed to the grassroots. I don't want to name a name here, but I'll just describe an experience I had when I was at one of these conferences a while ago, a couple years ago, and eating lunch with somebody who worked at another environmentalist organization. And the person I was eating lunch with said, "Oh yeah, we don't use the word activist in our organization. We're a solutions-oriented organization." You might be able to guess which group this is. And it was because they believed that the term activist would scare away the businesses that they wanted on their side. And I thought, I mean, I understand kind of their mission and their purpose and why they do that. But I also thought, if that becomes the face of the environmental movement, it's going to significantly damage the ability of the grassroots to organize and do something collectively. People don't want to participate in, marches, protests, red letters to the editor or anything else unless they feel like their voices matter. People need to feel that their agency counts for something. And I think that that's perhaps the major reason why the grassroots needs to be a part of solution seeking, alongside with, looking for solutions with those business elites.
Had one very specific question, maybe as a follow-up, and it's asking for how. So, how can activists, academics, researcher work better with marginalized communities to mitigate and adapt climate change that directly impacts them? And I think the question of does the grassroots include Black, Latinx, indigenous communities enough to really sort of advance those issues, and how do you actually accomplish that when, on the other hand, you have to or you want to engage with economic and political elites that might not be as interested in that?
Yeah, I can go first on this one, and then Kady can offer a better answer than the one I offer. And I say better because I'm just going to offer an anecdote that I just read about like yesterday, so it's kind of fresh in my mind. And this relates to that New Yorker article about fishing in Gambia, and the sort of the conflict that is occurring there within the environmental movement is that many environmental organizations are trying to push for food types that are not so bad for the environment. And if you're looking at protein, beef, pork, and other kinds of protein are oftentimes the worst for the environment. There's a lot of emissions, a lot of gases that are bad for climate change. But fishing has often been kind of put out there as like potentially more sustainable kind of food, and so these kind of mass fisheries, can exist that don't do nearly as much damage. But it turns out that the major food source for many of these fisheries is called fish meal, and it's a kind of a product that's created from like local fisheries where they'll take local fish that maybe people don't want to eat in restaurants, or you wouldn't buy at the grocery store, but they do create good food for the other fish. Anyway, long story short, they have created like massive fish meal production plants that are essentially destroying like the local villages and fishing sources in the Gambian communities and economy. And so as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, okay, what does an activist do and who's like locally oriented? Because the solution that's being put out there by the broader environmental movement is one that's actually doing real damage to the local people living in this country, living in these communities, and people who are often people of color. And so the solution is one that is at odds with their way of living. I don't have a solution. I'm just pointing out that the discussions that we talk about at the global level have to include the local communities that are often suffering the brunt of environmental damages.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I'll say thank you for the question. I love being asked, how do I help in a real and authentic way that's actually helping? That's the best question I could get. I would say when it comes to following and supporting frontline environmental justice organizations, the first thing I would say is just to listen we have a lot to learn from these communities, and to find ways to support them. So, maybe you have read about the environmental injustice on Chicago's South Side and Southeast Side. Attend an event that they put on. Go to these communities and sort of show up and be ready to support, but like without an agenda, without an idea, without a preconceived notion, like, oh, I have like this skill to add, or I have this skill to add, before even knowing what they need. And so, maybe that they actually, if you're like, how can I help? And you ask that, and maybe they need like help entering data or making phone calls or something that, is maybe not your skill set, but is their need. And so maybe they just need money, and you giving, $5 a month or whatever you can afford is the thing to most help. But I think building true and just relationships and understandings, assuming that you're not from one of these communities, is important, because I think a lot of times a trap that I see folks coming into is either one, just coming and just like wanting to kind of harvest for information, or coming with a preconceived notion of like, here, I can solve this thing for you. And the reality is that communities that are on the front lines of these injustices are a wealth of solutions and information and stories, and they have so much to add. And so if the question is, how do I help? I think really going to the source, listening, like I said, these folks put on Zoom town halls and events where you can really hear from them and learn firsthand, and not only through news articles, but from them directly, and figure out ways to support. Because like I said, these are vibrant communities, but they're also very smart and understand these solutions and are ready to make the change. And so it's important that we listen and follow their lead.
Okay. Maybe just building on that, there's been a couple of questions around that. To what extent do you think a sort of incrementalist approach, where you try and work with particular actors on sort of fairly confined problems, and sort of radical incrementalism is sometimes the term that you hear, right? It's sort of nudging toward climate action. Is a sufficient strategy for addressing the fundamental problem, or is there a need for advocating for a more systemic change in the way that our economic system, our political system actually operates?
It's a great question. And I guess what I would say is it's inspired by something Kady was describing, which is the importance of engaging with local issues as a way to mobilize people. We know from lots of research on social movements and activism that people get drawn in to a movement because there's an issue that they really feel passionate about. And for most people who are getting into the environmental movement, it's not going to be because that they see that chart I put up about emissions, or they see the chart about rising temperatures. They're going to look at those charts and feel hopeless, right? They're not going to feel like they can have an impact. But when they see a local issue that they care about, and they see how it's having an impact on their local community, they do get engaged. And so one reason why radical incrementalism works is because it's the door that opens up the access to a bigger engagement with the activist community. We need everybody, like the environmental movement needs everybody involved if we're going to have radical change. But you don't get to radical change without getting people involved first with what matters to them most, which is their homes, their communities, how it's affecting their personal lives.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's exactly how we think about it as campaigners and as organizers. And also, I live and breathe the radical incrementalism, right? And one city here and one coal plant down here and one state legislation here. But I also, over the past couple of years, I've recognized I'm not sure that you have to name them as mutually exclusive. And what I mean is this is, over the past couple of years, especially when we've had such a hostile federal administration, when we've seen us unprecedented attacks on, our bedrock environmental laws, things we did not think were controversial, like, the Clean Water Act. And, I think has really brought to the forefront in which, a couple years ago, if you showed me all the polling for candidates who were running for office in Illinois and what issues they found mattered most to voters in this state, environmental was like maybe in the top 10, whereas in 2018 in the midterms, it was in the top 3 in every congressional district in the state. And so, recognizing that, I really think we have had a real big change in how these issues are perceived by decision makers in the last 4 years. And I think in part because of the administration, but in part because we had been building a movement and a narrative for such a long time, to feel like not only were we not going to make progress, we were taking significant steps backwards, I do think was an inflection point for a lot of people to say, oh my gosh, this is now like one of the top things I care about in the world, because it's gotten to this point and they're kind of educated enough to know. And so recognizing that in that moment, there are things that they could do, to sort of try to push at the federal level, whether it's a march or a rally or whatever the thing is. But we were there and other groups were there providing ways that they could, push their mayor, push, their local state legislature, flip their congressional district to now be represented by someone who believed in climate change. Those are really concrete things that are personal for people that they want to get involved in, that are not mutually exclusive to like showing up in the streets on a Sunday also and pushing for that. But it does feel like, sort of incrementalism that we had been doing for like, decades had this inflection point in the past couple of years. And I think is ultimately also, gotten us to where we are in this specific moment in time.
Cool. I want to sort of shift gears a little bit, and maybe it builds on this sort of changing environment. There's been arguably a sort of a lost period in the US with a lot of climate denial, misinformation, polarization that has sort of really impeded significant action here. And at the same time, there you see the rise of more authoritarian governments around the world that make it much more difficult for climate activists to be effective. What do you make of that challenge? Is this something that we're getting out of? Does it require a different set of targets? Does it require a different set of tactics to be effective?
Well, I was waiting for Kady to answer that question. So, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, obviously I think it's had the polarization, but also the term that like a lot of people are, social scientists are now using is political sectarianism, which is sort of like this idea that we just kind of go to our own little groups and we only listen to people who think like us. We only talk to people who have the same political beliefs as us. That's a threat to democracy in the sense that we're not able to actually have cross conversations that look for real solutions to any of our problems. So I would say that it's a threat to making a democracy functional. But yeah, of course, it's going to be also a threat to searching for environmental causes. You can't push for meaningful change if half the country doesn't believe that change is necessary because they're in climate denial. So yeah, I mean, I used to think that education, sort of people are logical and education is the answer to that. I'm not saying I don't believe in education anymore, too. But I think, along with that, we have to think of more creative solutions that involve, kind of breaking down these silos that have been created. And I don't have a lot to say about that, but I think that is something that needs to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my work is limited to the US, but it is entirely dependent on a functioning democracy. And the types of things that we do are basically at the core, what we do is give people skills and motivation to engage in the democratic process to push for environmental action, whether that's, voting or attending a public hearing or attending a city council meeting or, showing up to give public comment on an administrative EPA rule, which is like a very sort of like a specific thing, and we have to give the narrative as to why this is important and why it matters. And almost all of the things that we're doing are encouraging people to engage in democracy, and to me that's very inspiring and powerful. And so the first thing of that is we also need to protect our democracy, and that is a thing that the environmental movement has recognized, the Sierra Club has recognized. But another thing I'll say is, as there are shifts with any campaign, whether it be, now at some point we have a friendly administration, at some point we don't, at some point we have a friendly governor, at some point we don't, there's always shifting landscape when you're in activism. There's always, maybe, you have a corporate target and they get bought by another one, or, everything's always changing, and that's part of your calculus. And so, when we knew that for 4 years we were going to be on the defensive at the federal level, we pivoted to a state-based strategy, and we were focusing on passing legislation in the states. And that just to the point where, like, I'm almost kind of rusty at how to do federal organizing. I'm having to reteach myself that, because that's just part of the nature of the work, is you have to be adaptable to the circumstances. Our job is to find where are the openings and run for them, and the pressure points, and that's how we're able to have the successes that we're having. And so to the extent that there are changing landscapes in any sort of sense, you have to adapt to that. And if that means a literal threat to democracy, perhaps focusing and on preserving our democracy has to come first, and we actually just stop talking about the environment and just focus on that in that country or whatnot, because that's what's needed in order to take action.
I want to sort of bring us close to the end, and there were a number of questions that are around sort of focusing public attention, the sort of more broadly societal institutions on the urgency of climate action and the urgency of the challenge, and not let, on the one hand, sort of distractions like, the denial of scientific facts sort of get in the way, but also sort of mitigate against sort of more escapist utopian ideas of, let's just ditch the world and colonize Mars, or, look for the silver bullet technical solution that can fix it all. How do you see activism and sort of environmental organizations setting an agenda that really focuses on focuses everyone on the goal and on the urgency of action? What are some of the options that are successful for doing that you see?
Well,
easy question.
Yeah, sure.
How do we?
I think a good place, actually, maybe a final comment from me on this, is that I think that the future of the environmental activism is younger people. So my kids and younger are obviously the group of people who are going to be most affected by climate change or any kind of environmental destruction, and so therefore getting that group of people involved because they feel passionate and they feel good about it is essential to solving this problem. And I think that's where also I'm most hopeful, because when I look at the pictures of the climate marches, of the climate strike, you see young people's faces. It's not just Greta Thunberg; she's obviously an icon at this point, but you also see lots of young people, kids, who are on the front line. And I think that for all of our faults, humans have a soft spot for children, and as they see the faces of young people passionately arguing for this, it will also have an impact on the old people like us, like me.
Yeah, I cannot disagree with finding hope in the next generation. Man, they are cool right now. It's fun to see what they're doing. But I also think that, you know, that alone is not going to get us there. And frankly, this is in the hands of people like Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer and the CEOs of the top companies right now, because we can't wait. We don't have time. If we wait for the young people to grow up, we will lose. So, you know, I hope that we're able to leverage that, but also recognizing that the people in power now are actually the most important, because we can't do this and we simply have no more time.
Thank you, Kady. Thank you, Brayden, for a very frank conversation. And I think we can, to answer the question, saving the world, we're not sure, but we have to try regardless, right? So there's no way around it. So thank you for joining today. There were a number of questions that asked for specific sort of research around activism, and I would direct all of those who asked to Brayden, who knows this body of research really well, and just reach out to the panelists directly. We will resume our series next Tuesday on March 9th. And we're going to welcome Mike Hume, who's a professor at the University of Cambridge, who has a long history and experience in climate change research. And he's going to talk about why storytelling is key to climate action. So I hope to see many of you back then for our series on climate action at Buffett with our co-sponsors at ISIN and Sustain You. So thanks very much for joining, and we'll see you next week. Stay well.
Thanks, Klaus. Thanks, Kady.